Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode. I'm delighted to be joined today by Joshi Venugopal, one of our keynote speakers from CDMO Live. Joshi is head of region for Europe for Novartis Gene Therapy and Rare Diseases and senior vice president. And he brings a remarkable breadth of experience spanning R&D, early stage pipeline development, and extensive in-market commercialization. Prior to this role, as head of new products, he was responsible for shaping Novartis' early pipeline, valued at an impressive $60 billion US. Joshi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
To start with, it'd be great to learn a bit more about your journey through the industry and what led to your current role, please.
So look, I believe that the early steps that you take in your career typically have a disproportionate influence on your career journey later. After completing my PhD in cell biology, I was asking, what do I do next? And the obvious options were either staying in academic research or going to industry or going for other tracks of career like publishing, consulting, etc. And then I thought more deeply about it and I realized it doesn't matter what track you take. All career tracks leads to management. If you're a university professor and you become the president of a university, it's management. If you're a lab head, most of them spend time writing brands like a biotech CEO who is trying to raise funds. So I saw more similarities than differences in career tracks. And I got fascinated with management as a concept. At that time, Peter Drucker's books had a huge influence in me. And he said a lot of the progress we had in the modern society is a consequence of modern management. No earlier societies were able to bring large groups of people from very different places and put them into a productive task. So I got really fascinated with management and general management. And in pharmaceutical industry, where I went because of the impact it creates on the society and patients, I took a conscious decision to work in research, development, early product planning, commercial, run countries, regions, and that breadth is what I was chasing. And between a specialist and a generalist, I was very tempted to have a broad understanding. And I felt that the magic comes and the beauty comes when you connect the dots.
Peter Drucker, by the way, he also famously said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I'm just wondering, when you're talking about management theory and building companies made of people, what are your thoughts on the role of AI in the workplace at the moment? Because massive potential in all different areas, all of those different departments you mentioned for the role of AI. How are you thinking about that at the moment?
Personally, I believe AI would significantly enhance the productivity of individuals, right? So I, as a person, can do many things with the help of AI where I don't have to depend on somebody else. So on one hand, it is very empowering to every individual. But on the other hand, it will create disruption. Some new careers will come out of it. Some existing career tracks may feel less and less important as you go forward. So I think the world is going to go through some sort of creative destruction. And I believe as policymakers, their aim would be how to make it very smooth in a way that is supportive and empathetic to the workforce involved. I fundamentally believe there will always be a need for human creativity, ingenuity, etc. But it will be redefined. I mean, computers did a little bit of that when computers came.
That breadth of experience that you're describing there, what perspective do you think that gives you to the gene therapy space? Because you've played a role in so many of the building blocks of that, does that give you a unique perspective?
It does, because you understand research, you understand development, you understand science, you understand the enterprise view, but you also understand how it is like to be in a country.
Mm.
And all of these perspectives combine together for you to have a blended outlook on the reality as it is. And many times I feel people who are very myopic and only see one perspective are at a disadvantage.
Let's talk about the European landscape for gene therapy. So there have been some recent high-profile exits from Europe, such as Bluebird Bio, for example. What do you think the potential is in Europe right now for gene therapies?
If you look at the population of Europe, it is roughly double than that of the United States. So in terms of patient numbers,
Hmm.
you have twice the potential. We also know that the pricing in Europe is lower than that of the US. So it's a question of balancing act. How much more volume can you get, and how little price discount you would have to give to justify the Europe HTA mechanisms. The companies that have been able to go very broad in terms of access, in terms of the countries, and who have been able to defend the price actually do a very good job in commercializing within Europe. I know few products where the European sales is significantly higher than the US sales. But in majority of the cases,
in value or volume or both?
Both.
Hmm.
In several cases, it's often US biotechs who do not have too much cash at hand, and they would have to prioritize. And of course, they rightly prioritized US, and they do not go very broad in the European landscape. They don't invest early enough prior to the launch, and therefore they are leaving money on the table. There's no easy solution for that. But that is one of the reasons the European potential is underestimated and underachieved.
Why is that? I mean, why is it such a challenging market? Is it because it's, if you compare it to the US, which is obviously, one market, is it the fragmented nature of the different states?
Yes.
So what are the challenges?
That is one of the important distinguishing features. Europe is not a one-stop shop. It's very fragmented, and you need to do the pricing and reimbursement process country by country. Most of the biotechs that I've seen, they typically focus on a few European countries: Germany, France, in most cases, sometimes Italy, Spain, UK. And that is only half of the European population. And the rest is not really targeted. And that is why I said we are not going for very broad access. And these companies are not in a position to go very broad and have a very broad geographic footprint. But the potential in Europe does exist. The question is, how do you harness it?
Russia, for example, is, I think, often underestimated, just the sheer size of that population.
That's right. Russia has roughly half the population of the US.
How has Novartis been able to navigate some of these challenges where others struggle? Are there any particular strategies or steps you might recommend for how to unlock the potential?
Yeah, being a large pharmaceutical company with a very broad geographic footprint, we can naturally leverage our existing teams, their relationships, their knowledge of the healthcare ecosystem and the pricing and reimbursement landscape. So that is one advantage I believe any large pharmaceutical company has. The second advantage we had, and this was a conscious decision, is we wanted to go very broad, and we wanted to give as much as access as we possibly could. And therefore, we were prepared to have very innovative pricing and reimbursement models. And at the same time, being cognizant of the realities that payers face in this market. The third point would be Novartis really work with all these stakeholders to amplify the need for newborn screening for our the conditions in which our gene therapies are indicated for. And this is the best outcome for the patient's early diagnosis and treatment.
Interesting. When you mention innovative price and reimbursement models, would you be able to give just a bit of a flavor for what that would look like?
There are many models in the industry. The challenge payers often face is when they have to make an upfront payment for a therapy whose impact will last for several years.
Hmm.
The payers are very much used to chronic treatments where payments are spread over time. And when suddenly they have a budget impact, which is very high because of the upfront costs, it may be challenging for them. So one of the common approaches these days is to look at payment models that have some type of installments built in it, where they don't have to pay everything upfront, they pay a portion, and then the rest of the payments is spread over time. So that is one model. The other challenge with some of the gene therapy products is that we don't have real long-term data, or the clinical trials are probably small to have very concrete inferences that you would get from a large mortality and morbidity trial in cardiovascular, for example. Yeah? So sometimes we may have 20 patients in our trial. Some of the other trials are 5,000 patients. So it's a very different richness of the data set. So to manage that uncertainty, what we also do is pay for performance models where some of these installments are linked to outcomes.
To de-risk it for the payer.
It's to de-risk it for the payer, right? So that is something that many companies have also considered. So the installment scheme, but where some of the installments are linked to certain outcomes. It could be like a reward for achieving some outcomes, or it could be a penalty for failing to meet some outcomes. It's whichever way you structure it.
Of all the different modalities which are available today, which would you say are the most promising, and why? I mean, are there any specific disease areas or technology advances which you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, right now, most of the gene therapies are focused on very severe diseases, often monogenic, in cells that are not dividing. Remember, if you are giving a gene therapy and if the cell divides, you are diluting the gene therapy because the plasmid is not multiplying. So that's how we are currently focusing on. And in that space, of course, neuromuscular diseases is a very important one because neurons do not divide, it's very severe. There are many monogenic. So that's one interesting space. Now, many people do ask, can we see gene therapy being applied for a little bit more prevalent diseases? But it may not even be monogenic. There may be multifactorial causes for those diseases. Yes, I think so. And one of the most likely areas will be ophthalmology. Because in ophthalmology, you need much less dose. So the cost problem will be addressed to some extent. Eye is an immune privilege organ, and therefore we may not have some safety-related issues. And there are many prevalent diseases like age-related macular degeneration, geographic atrophy. They are not rare, and therefore they may be a sweet spot.
Much larger population sizes.
Much larger population sizes, lower cost for manufacturing per unit. And of course, the safety profile will be good. Remember, when you're giving intraretinal injections, the systemic exposure is often very limited as opposed to giving something IV.
So, I mean, do you think then that focusing on those types of areas will help to democratize access to gene therapies?
Possibly, but that's what I see in the immediate future. But if I can give a much more longer time horizon, then we need to think about what new technologies are evolving. You have non-viral vectors as an example. They can carry larger cargos. They can be engineered to be selective to certain tissues and therefore will have less side effects. They may be easier to manufacture and therefore the cost will be down. They may not have immune reactions in the body, so you can even redose it. It doesn't have to be a one-time therapy. So when those technologies mature, and we are still many years from those technologies being mature, then of course we will think about other diseases which are more prevalent. There is a school of thought that believes cell and gene therapies would be used like small molecules or antibodies in the future. I'm not there yet, but I certainly do believe that it will uh, shift from today's application to very severe monogenic diseases to a little bit more prevalent and multifactorial diseases.
It's interesting. How would you see that then working in 10 years' time, for example? Where would you see the role of gene therapies alongside small molecules and biologics? I guess it depends on the particular disease and the problem, but how generally would you see them playing together?
It's a little bit like, if you look at biologics and small molecules today, there is a lot of interplays of these two modalities in the therapeutic area. Now you have to add into radioligand therapies, RNA interference, antibody drug conjugate. They're all coming into play. And as you said, it will depend on the disease by disease context. For very advanced technologies that have complex logistics and high manufacturing costs, it may not be the first option. And that is why the research would be better directed at very severe conditions that do not have a lot of effective treatments.
Bringing it back to today, costs right now are so high for some of these treatments. What role do you see commercial partners playing in helping to roll out a more of a global strategy for some of these gene therapies?
So we try very hard to give access to these modalities globally. And in the case of our gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, we have been able to strike agreements with payers and governments, even in emerging markets. So we feel relatively proud of what we have accomplished in terms of broad access, but it is still not enough. And there are a lot of countries where access is still a distant dream. With the cost coming down and with the payer landscape in these countries evolving, things would get better. That's my hope. But we should also remember, it's not only a cost issue. You need centers of excellence. You need expertise to manage these very complicated therapies. So capacity building, capability building is also important at the provider side.
What would you say the biggest barriers are for widespread adoption at the moment? I mean, you mentioned a couple then. I mean, what are the sort of the limiting factors, and how would you aim to resolve those?
So this would be different country by country or by the economic status of the country. But if I'm looking at the high and middle income countries, I still believe diagnosis is one of the key challenges. For these therapies to show the best result for the patient, early diagnosis and treatment is important. And many gene therapies are indicated for the early stages of these diseases. And if you miss that window, the patient is not eligible for these therapies. So it is very important for early diagnosis and treatment. And many times, these patients with rare diseases, they have to circle from doctors to doctors to get the right diagnosis. Because there are so many rare genetic disorders, and the awareness of all of these is not there in the system. So patients spend a lot of time figuring out the disease, and by the time they get treatment, it is too delayed. In conditions where they have newborn screening, where newborns are screened for this condition, you have much better results because you're treating those patients immediately. And getting those early diagnoses is, I believe, super crucial as gene therapies come into play. And one of the common factors I've observed among gene therapies that have not commercially been able to scale up, early diagnosis is a missing link.
You've recently taken on a role as board member of Genetics, a biotech dedicated to developing innovative therapies for rare diseases. Interested to know a little bit about that and what sort of advice you'd give more generally to gene therapy biotechs which are trying to make an impact. What sort of advice would you have for the CEO of a biotech?
Fall in love with the problem and a big problem, and not fall in love with your solution.
What difference does that make?
Because if you look at the several companies out there, you need to be emotionally detached somehow to see if your product has a realistic chance to make an impact in the market. But also, you have to be super passionate to drive that. So you need that dichotomy.
It's a hard balance, isn't it?
Yeah. But that's what I feel, that sometimes you just have to ask very simple questions as to what is in the market right now. Why would somebody adopt it? Just because you have a great product doesn't mean that people will adopt it. There's a lot of great products that have succeeded. There are a lot of great products that have failed. Think of inhaled insulin as an example. When given the option of injecting insulin versus inhaling insulin, almost all market surveys suggested patients would prefer inhaled insulin rather than pricking their body every day. 4 large companies developed those. All of them failed. It's not because the product was not good. It was not because the patient didn't like it, but was because FDA mandated lung function tests for inhaled insulin. The endocrinologists who were supposed to prescribe these as the early adopters, they didn't have spirometers in their practice. So you have to think about all these practical realities of how medicine is practiced today, and will your product fit in with the flow? Yes, you can change the flow, but that's a very high bar.
What role would you say CDMOs have to play? CROs, CDMOs, contract services. For someone who's working on a new therapy, new treatment, how early would you advise people to engage with that ecosystem?
Most biotechs are engaging with the CDMO ecosystem very early on. And for them, a lot of their early funding is going to pay the CDMOs for the work that they would do. Right? Like GMP grade manufacturing as an example, like GLP tox studies, all of those things. So that collaboration is happening. Most biotechs are heavily dependent on that. Now, we also know that the current investment climate is a bit suboptimal. And there are a lot of biotech companies that are struggling to raise finances. If CDMOs can figure out a way in which, of course, selectively, they can have a stake in the biotech company and be a partner in helping them out, that would be an interesting model, and it would be a win-win model if they have a long-term horizon.
How do you think advances in whole genome sequencing and delivery technologies are likely to make an impact in the years to come?
It's a great question.
As mentioned earlier, early diagnosis is crucial to ensure good outcomes in rare disease conditions. Roughly 388 hereditary diseases that develop in childhood can be treated effectively if diagnosed early. According to some estimates, this number will increase to 1,000 by 2030. Now compare that with the newborn screenings that are happening in our countries. Italy, with the best track record of newborn screenings in Europe, has 60 conditions in the screening list. Several countries have low single digits of conditions screened. So if you can implement routine whole genome sequencing of the newborns, there would be a rapid increase in the diagnosis of rare disease conditions, offering better outcomes for patients and caregivers. Of course, this has its own sets of challenges. We need to think about data privacy. We need to think about our healthcare system and if they would be able to meet the demand if so many conditions are diagnosed all of a sudden. We need to think of which condition should we screen. Only those ones who have the treatment, or also those conditions who doesn't have a treatment. So there are a lot of things one has to think through, but the promise of routine whole genome sequencing for newborn is so great that we will have to figure out a way to manage this because the life of children are precious.
Thank you. Stepping back a bit then, Joshi, what's your vision for where gene therapy is going and the trajectory that we're on? You've spoken recently about a Gartner maturity curve for different technologies. Is that how you see it, like a sort of a slow progression to the plateau of productivity, or is there sort of an exponential curve coming? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think if you look at the gene therapy space over time, it pretty much follows a Gartner curve, where there was a lot of hype early. This was following the first clinical trial and Human Genome Project. And then there was a sudden loss of faith, followed by some of the safety incidents that happened earlier. Also, the first FDA-approved gene therapy did not meet the commercial expectations. So all of these things have led to a downward sentiment. And I think now we are slowly coming back up. But the sentiment is still not anywhere near what it used to be, right? We are still at the bottom, but coming back up. And I feel that over the next 10 to 15 years, probably 15 years, we will reach the plateau of productivity driven by changes in diagnosis, whole genome sequencing being one. Driven by technology, we talked about scalable manufacturing, vector enhancements, both viral and non-viral, and also new modalities like gene editing, which does things that gene replacement cannot. And then the third one is, we also mentioned a lot of the biotech companies are not able to commercialize very broadly, and they need to focus on a few small markets in Europe. But if there are real good commercial engines, which very broad geographic coverage, that can take these products and commercialize them, that will also lead to the increase of adoption of these gene therapies, and will be able to reach much more patients. So all of these combined together, it's a confluence of these conditions, which I believe would help the gene therapy field reach its plateau of productivity.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you today, Joshi. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Luke. Thanks for having me.
And we're looking forward to you speaking at CDMO Live, of course, in May.
Likewise, looking forward as well.
Experience the future of contract manufacturing at CDMO Live 2025. Join us at the World Trade Centre Rotterdam on May the 7th and 8th, 2025 for an exclusive event that brings together the sharpest minds in biopharma outsourcing. For 2 days filled with market insights, best practices and partnering. So head to cdmolive.com to download the agenda and to book your ticket.